Chapter 1: The Summer of Love and the Church of Chemistry. Welcome to Synapse Daily. The year is 1967. If you were standing on the corner of Haight and Ashbury in San Francisco, you'd be surrounded by the summer of love. Thousands of young people were dreaming of a world without war, a world of natural connection. But 2,000 miles away, in the gleaming limestone and glass headquarters of Monsanto in St. Louis, Missouri, a different kind of revolution was peaking. This wasn't a revolution of flowers and folk songs. It was a revolution of the molecule. In 1967, Monsanto wasn't just a company, it was a sprawling industrial empire that functioned like the high priesthood of progress. They didn't sell products, they sold a destiny they called the Chemical Utopia. Visualize the boardrooms of 1967. Men in narrow ties, sipping coffee from plastic cups, a Monsanto invention, looking at charts that pointed only upward. To these men, nature was a flawed system. It was messy, unpredictable, and inefficient. They believed that through the mastery of synthetic chemistry, they could strip away the errors of evolution. They envisioned a sterile, manageable planet where human desire dictated biological reality. This was the peak of the man-over-nature era. But 1967 was also the year the mask began to slip. Behind the polished brochures, the company was grappling with a terrifying internal realization: their miracle molecules were not disappearing. They were accumulating. Today, we peel back the layers of that 1967 campaign to see how a corporate dream became a global biological reality. Like this video if you learned something. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more fascinating stories. Chapter 2: The Marketing of a Miracle, Engineering the Mind. How do you convince a post-war generation to abandon thousands of years of natural living for a life of synthetics? You used the most powerful psychological tool in history, the promise of purity. In 1967, Monsanto's marketing machine was a masterpiece of social engineering. Their advertisements in National Geographic and the Saturday Evening Post were vibrant, saturated works of art. They featured the house of the future, a structure made entirely of plastic. They marketed a world where the floor was plastic, the food was wrapped in plastic, and even the grass in the yard was a Monsanto invention called AstroTurf. The message was subtle but devastating: natural is dirty, synthetic is clean. They marketed herbicides like Lasso and Ramrod as liberation for the American farmer. In 1967, a Monsanto ad didn't show a farmer sweating in a field, it showed a man in a clean white shirt, standing next to a tractor, looking at a field where not a single weed dared to grow. They framed nature as an insurgent force that needed to be suppressed. A weed wasn't just a plant, it was an economic thief. By 1967, Monsanto had successfully shifted the cultural paradigm. The Chemical Utopia wasn't just a suggestion, it was presented as the inevitable next step in human evolution. If you weren't using chemistry to improve your lawn, your kitchen, or your crops, you were seen as a relic of a primitive past. But what the ads never showed was where these chemicals went once the rain started falling. Chapter 3: The PCB Shadow, The Secret of Snow Creek. Now, we leave the bright lights of the marketing departments and travel to Anniston, Alabama. This is where the utopia was manufactured, and this is where the shadow was darkest. In 1967, Monsanto was the world leader in the production of polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. These were the unbreakable chemicals. They were fire-resistant, stable, and used in everything from electrical transformers to the ink in your newspaper. To the bean counters in St. Louis, PCBs were a goldmine. But 1967 was the year of the internal panic. Documents uncovered decades later show that Monsanto's own scientists were finding that PCBs were a global contaminant. They found that when PCBs were released into the water, fish died within minutes. They found that these chemicals did not break down in the environment, they bioaccumulated, moving from the mud to the worms, to the fish, and eventually, to the people. In an internal memo from 1967, a Monsanto executive wrote, "We can't afford to lose $1 of business." Despite knowing that their plant in Anniston was discharging tons of PCB-laden waste into Snow Creek, a creek where local children played, the company chose silence. They chose the utopia of the balance sheet over the reality of the biosphere. While the public was being told chemistry would save the world, Monsanto's own labs were proving that chemistry was silently coating the planet in a permanent layer of toxin. This wasn't an accident, it was a calculated risk where the public was the collateral. Chapter 4: The Vietnam Connection, Chemistry as a Weapon. While the American housewife was being sold a synthetic dream, the chemical utopia was taking a much more violent form in the jungles of Southeast Asia. 1967 was the peak of Operation Ranch Hand. The U.S. military was desperate to strip the Viet Cong of their cover in the dense triple canopy rainforests. They turned to Monsanto for the solution. That solution was Agent Orange. In 1967, Monsanto's factories were running 24/7 to produce millions of gallons of this powerful defoliant. But there was a hidden passenger in every barrel, TCDD, the most toxic form of dioxin. Monsanto knew their production process was contaminated. They knew that by rushing the manufacturing to meet wartime demands, they were increasing the dioxin levels to lethal concentrations. As planes sprayed the rainbow herbicides over millions of acres in 1967, the utopia ideology was being used to justify ecological scorched earth tactics. They told the pilots and the soldiers it was safe as aspirin. But the dioxin didn't just kill the leaves. It entered the soil. It entered the water. It entered the DNA of the people below. The contrast is haunting. In St. Louis, Monsanto was celebrating a better world through chemistry. In Vietnam, that same chemistry was causing birth defects and cancers that would last for 4 generations. In 1967, the utopia and the war zone were two sides of the same coin, the arrogant belief that humans could use chemistry to bypass the laws of biology without ever paying the price. Chapter 5: The Science of Silence, the Manufacturing of Authority. How does a corporation maintain a utopia when the birds are falling from the trees? In 1967, Monsanto perfected a strategy that would become the blueprint for industrial deception for the next century: the science of silence. To the public, the scientist in 1967 was a figure of absolute authority. White coats, thick glasses, and pocket protectors were symbols of an objective, almost divine truth. Monsanto didn't fight this authority, they bought it. By 1967, Monsanto had established a revolving door between its corporate labs and the nation's top agricultural universities. They funded the grants, they built the wings of the buildings, and they vetted the curriculum. If a researcher in 1967 found that a Monsanto pesticide was disrupting the endocrine system of honeybees, that researcher faced a wall of silence. Monsanto's toxicology departments were not designed to find the truth, they were designed to curate the truth. They pioneered the negative result, a method of designing experiments so narrow that the desired toxicity would never appear. In 1967, the company also mastered the art of ghostwriting. Scientific papers were written by Monsanto's internal staff and then signed by prestigious university professors to give them the veneer of independent academic rigor. This created a hall of mirrors. When a regulator at the FDA or the USDA looked for the safety data on a new chemical, they found a mountain of evidence, all of it trailing back to the same source. The utopia was protected by a fortress of footnotes, ensuring that any dissent was branded as unscientific or emotional hysterics. Chapter 6: The Patenting of Life, the 1967 Legal Gambit. While the labs were cooking chemicals, Monsanto's legal team in 1967 was attempting something even more radical: the colonization of the genetic code. Before the late 1960s, the seed was seen as a common heritage of humanity. You planted a seed, you harvested the crop, and you saved the seeds for next year. Monsanto saw this as a market inefficiency. They realized that if they could own the intellectual property of the seed itself, they could turn every farmer on Earth into a permanent subscriber to their chemical ecosystem. 1967 was a pivotal year for lobbying in Washington, D.C. Monsanto's lawyers were pushing for a broader interpretation of the plant variety protection concepts. They wanted to move away from chemistry and toward bioengineering. They weren't just looking to kill weeds, they were looking to design the miracle seed, a plant that was biologically hardwired to only survive if it was sprayed with Monsanto's proprietary chemicals. This was the birth of the closed-loop system. It was a brilliant, cold-blooded business model. In the 1967 strategy meetings, they envisioned a future where a farmer could not legally save a seed from his own harvest because that seed's blueprints belonged to a boardroom in St. Louis. They were planning the death of agricultural independence under the guise of modernizing the food supply. By 1967, the utopia had expanded its borders from the soil and the water into the very nucleus of the cell. Chapter 7: The Plasticized Soul, Domesticating the Laboratory. We must talk about the psychological shift of 1967. This was the year the utopia entered the American living room and took off its boots. Monsanto's 1967 campaign was obsessed with the concept of the synthetic home. They marketed a lifestyle where the natural world was replaced by a more durable version. This was the peak of the disposable society. They taught housewives that washing a glass bottle was a waste of time. It was more modern to use a Monsanto-designed plastic container and throw it away. They sold AstroTurf to schools, telling parents that real grass was a breeding ground for germs and insects. They sold polyester and acrylic fabrics, telling the world that wool was scratchy and primitive. This wasn't just about selling products, it was about aesthetic conditioning. They wanted to create a generation of people who felt uncomfortable in the presence of real, decaying, chaotic nature. In 1967, the utopia meant a world that was perpetually new. A world that didn't rot, didn't smell like earth, and didn't change with the seasons. They were domesticating the laboratory, turning every suburban home into a micro-extension of their chemical plants. If you lived in a plastic house, wore plastic clothes, and walked on plastic grass, you were much less likely to care about the toxic runoff in a creek in Alabama. You were living in the Mirage, and the Mirage felt wonderful. Chapter 8: The Great Dilution Myth, the Ocean as a Trash Can. The final piece of the 1967 architecture was a scientific lie so large it was almost impossible to see: the doctrine of infinite dilution. In 1967, Monsanto's waste management policy was based on a simple, comforting sentence: the solution to pollution is dilution. They told their engineers and the public that the earth was so vast, and the oceans so deep, that any chemical we threw into them would simply vanish. They believed, or claimed to believe, that the Pacific Ocean was an infinite sink that could absorb a billion years of industrial sins. But internal 1967 reports on PCB migration were telling a different story. Their own researchers were finding that these chemicals didn't dilute. They clustered. They adhered to microscopic particles and traveled thousands of miles on ocean currents. They were being found in the fat of seals in the Antarctic and in the eggs of eagles in the Rockies. Monsanto ignored these findings. They continued to promote the dilution myth because the alternative, containment, was too expensive. To admit that the oceans were finite would be to admit that the utopia had a boundary. So, in 1967, they chose to treat the entire planet as a giant, open-air laboratory. They gambled that by the time the bill came due, they would be too big to fail. They weren't just dumping chemicals in. Chapter 9: The Silent Shareholders, the Financial Fortress of 1967. The chemical utopia was not just a scientific ambition, it was a financial fortress. In 1967, Monsanto was the darling of Wall Street. To understand how they sustained the Mirage despite the mounting evidence of toxicity, we must look at the bankers in their three-piece suits. Wall Street in 1967 operated on a singular, cold-blooded principle: growth is the only morality. Monsanto offered something better than growth, they offered dependency. Their business model was a cycle of plant obsolescence and chemical addiction. If the weeds grew resistant to one chemical, Monsanto sold a stronger one. If the soil became sterile, Monsanto sold the synthetic nutrient. The major investment houses and insurance firms of the era were the silent shareholders of this destruction. They didn't see the dying fish in Alabama, they saw a 15% year-over-year increase in dividends. In 1967, the financial world and the chemical world were fused. This created a social inertia. Even when government regulators had private doubts about PCB safety, they were hesitant to move against a company that anchored the pension funds of millions of Americans. Monsanto pioneered the externalization of cost. In their 1967 ledger, the profit from a gallon of Agent Orange was recorded in the asset column. The cost of treating a veteran's cancer 30 years later was not their problem, it was external. This was the true genius of the 1967 campaign. They convinced the world that the profits were private, but the poisons were public. They weren't just selling chemicals, they were selling a financial system that rewarded the destruction of the future. Chapter 10: The Molecular Coup, the AHR Receptor and the Ghost in the Gene. Let's look at the technical how. How did the choices made in 1967 fundamentally change human biology? It comes down to a specific mechanism called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, AHR. In 1967, Monsanto scientists were obsessed with the potency of dioxins in PCBs. What they didn't tell the public was that these molecules act like a master key to the human cell. When a molecule of TCDD, from Agent Orange, enters your body, it doesn't just sit there. It seeks out the AHR receptor, a protein that regulates how our genes are expressed. Once the chemical binds to that receptor, it enters the nucleus of the cell and begins to rewrite the software of life. It tells the body to grow tumors. It tells the immune system to attack itself. It tells the reproductive system to shut down. In 1967, the Utopia was essentially a molecular coup. They were releasing chemicals that had the power to override millions of years of evolutionary coding. Because these chemicals are fat-soluble, they hide in the mother's milk and the father's sperm. The choices made in a boardroom in 1967 were, in effect, a preemptive strike on the health of children born in 1990, 2010, and 2030. They created a ghost in the gene, a chemical legacy that can skip a generation only to reappear as a mystery illness decades later. Chapter 11: The Death of Diversity, 1967 and the Monoculture Mindset. One of the most tragic victims of the 1967 chemical utopia was diversity. Before the chemical boom, farming was a tapestry of thousands of different seed varieties, each adapted to its local climate. Monsanto's 1967 vision required a monoculture. Diversity is the enemy of industrial efficiency. To sell chemicals on a global scale, they needed the world to grow only a handful of supercrops, crops designed to survive their specific herbicides. In 1967, they began the systematic erasure of agricultural history. They used their marketing and legal might to push farmers away from heritage seeds. They marketed the standardized seed as a sign of progress. This led to a catastrophic narrowing of the global food supply. This monoculture mindset extended beyond the fields and into the human mind. They wanted us to eat the same processed foods, live in the same plastic houses, and believe the same corporate slogans. The utopia wasn't just about chemistry, it was about conformity. By 1967, they had successfully convinced the world that different was dangerous and that uniformity was safety. We are still living with the result, a fragile, chemical-dependent food system that is one superweed away from collapse. Chapter 12: The 2067 Retrospective, A Century of Reckoning. Now, we stand at the final horizon. Imagine it is the year 2067. Exactly 100 years since the peak of Monsanto's campaign. The house of the future is long gone, its plastic turned into microplastic dust that now coats every beach on Earth. The chemical utopia advertisements have faded into museum curiosities. But the chemicals themselves? They are still here. In 2067, the persistent organic pollutants, POPs, released during that 1967 peak are still being measured in the blood of newborns. The utopia did not bring a better world, it brought a permanent chemical burden. However, 2067 is also a year of reckoning. We now see that the Mirage of 1967 was the last gasp of an era that believed the Earth was a machine we could control. We have learned that nature cannot be optimized by a spray bottle. The utopia failed because it ignored the fundamental law of biology: everything is connected. You cannot poison a creek in Alabama without eventually poisoning a dinner plate in New York. You cannot defoliate a jungle in Vietnam without leaving a scar on the human genome. The story of 1967 is a warning. It is a reminder that when a corporation promises you perfection, they are usually selling you a prison. The real utopia isn't found in a lab, it's found in the messy, diverse, and resilient chaos of a world that refuses to be tamed by chemistry. Chapter 13, Conclusion: The past is inside us. Thank you for traveling with us through the high water mark of the chemical age. 1967 was a year of incredible music, radical politics, and a desperate corporate attempt to seize control of the future. Monsanto almost succeeded. They built a world in their image, saturated, synthetic, and seemingly indestructible. But as we have seen, the utopia was a lie. The molecules remain, but so does our will to uncover the truth. The science of silence has been broken. The secret memos have been read. The silent shareholders have been exposed. As you go about your day, remember, the past isn't just behind us. It is in the water we drink, the air we breathe, and the very cells of our bodies. 1967 is still happening. And the question remains, what will we choose to leave behind for the people of 2167? I'm your host for Synapse Daily. Stay curious. Stay skeptical. And above all, stay human. We will see you in the next episode.